Hello, Faith family, and welcome to our testimony channel, a new creation, True Life Testimonies. I am your host, Vanessa Moore. I am so pleased to announce our next guest. We spoke about the case for Christianity. This week, we're going to talk about the cold case for Christianity. Our next guest is an American homicide detective and Christian apologist. Wallace has authored several books, including Cold Case, Christianity, God's Crime Scene, and Forensic Faith. He also made an appearance sharing his testimony in the film, God's Not Dead Too. So please help me welcome our next guest, Detective Jim Warner Wallace.
I'm so glad we're together finally. We got it done. We made it happen.
Yes, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to do it.
I just wanted to say, like I mentioned earlier, the warfare leading up to this was really intense. So the fact that you're on here is a serious miracle. And so I believe that the Lord is going to move mountains through this and just speak through us. So I'm so happy you're here. Normally we have, people share their testimonies, and it's so funny when you agreed to do this, you just willingly agreed, and it was so sweet. And then I came across like 10 videos and all of them said, why I do not share my testimony. And I'm like, oh, great. So what am I supposed to do now? But so we'll just share a little bit about how you came to the faith, but I want to honor, your ministry and let you just talk about what you do now. So can you please tell us a little bit about how you came to the faith?
Well, and I think the issue when it comes to testimony is that I'm just such an evidentialist about these kinds of issues that I typically don't share my testimony. But, eventually I have to usually qualify it. And then, of course, people want to know what your story is. So I've always said that it's not a matter of an either or. Like, you should never share your testimony, but you should never share that just by itself without giving some reason for why Christianity is true. I'll tell you why. I've got Mormon family, 6 brothers and sisters, all raised LDS, and they are going to be, if you've ever had Mormon missionaries at your door, at some point when they are back into a position, they're going to share their testimony because they're told to do this, because it's a powerful tool, they are told, to help convert people to Mormonism. And it turns out that is actually, and if you listen to the testimony of Mormons, it is heartfelt.
Yeah,
it is. That's why I think by itself, it is, everyone can offer a testimony. And here's what you won't see on the pages of Scripture anywhere. You will never see an example of one of the disciples sharing their testimony in terms of, let me share with you how God changed my life. That you're never going to hear. And what you're going to hear instead is the testimony of eyewitnesses testifying to what they saw with the resurrection. And that's the way the word testimony is used, for example, in the book of Acts. So I try to follow that pattern. But yeah, for me, I was not somebody who was raised in the church, and people who shared their testimony with me, I thought were just like everybody else who shares their testimony. You might have Mormons at your door, Jehovah's Witnesses at your door, Christians will share their testimony. I just didn't want to hear it. And I was 35 before I ever took this seriously at all. And what I tried to do is to examine it to see if it was factually true, right? That was a big deal to me. And I examined it using the same skill set you would use to examine eyewitnesses in a criminal case. We have a criteria for eyewitnesses. And so I just used that. And it all started because a pastor had intrigued me with the person of Jesus, because he said he was the smartest person that ever lived. And I had never sat in a sermon to hear a preacher talk at all, let alone describe Jesus as smart. And so I was interested to see if that was true. And that's why I bought my first Bible. And really, that started this investigation that largely kind of capitalized on the skill set I had as a detective to determine if something is true from an eyewitness. And that's really how I became a Christian, because as I examined it, I became convinced it was true.
Well, it's amazing that you're talking about Mormonism too, because most of my family is Mormon as well. And so I'm so happy that you're here on this channel, because I've been trying to minister to, many groups of people, but trying to get away from the religion aspect of this. Like the word that really irks me is the word religion. And when I'm having these conversations with my family and ministering to them, it's the one thing that I'm like, it's very hard to describe the difference between religion and relationship. And so having you on here is actually, I've said that with Frank before, that it was, I have you on for honorable intentions, but also because, God says to take care of your family. And it's a blessing that all these things are coming up, like the week leading up to this conversation with you. We're talking things about abortion and everything that you're talking about right now, evidence, the difference between having faith and having an evidence. And I realized when I when I came to the faith, I was telling Frank that I had a radical conversion, but it wasn't enough to say that I have faith. I realized that I had to have evidence for my faith when I was coming up against, scholars, like, Ivy League scholars. I have to know my stuff.
Yeah, I'll tell you that I sometimes, so how I try to put it is, I was so unfamiliar with church and with church traditions. I was living in a part of Los Angeles where I felt like I was very comfortable as a non-believer. I was surrounded by other non-believers. I wasn't part of a Christian culture growing up. Didn't understand the words people used growing up. As a matter of fact, even the word relationship. If we say, okay, do you have a relationship with Jesus? Well, what does that mean? I need to know, when people use that term, what do they mean by the term? And where do they find this concept in Scripture? Because I'm sure they do. I just want to know where they find it so I can look at it and say, okay, now I understand what they mean by relationship. I think it's just as difficult to navigate that word as an unbeliever as the word religion is, right? So I use terms all the time. Do you have a relationship with Jesus? What do you mean a relationship with Jesus? I mean, okay, there's lots of other historical figures from the first century I also don't have a relationship with, like Nero. What do you mean by a relationship? And so, of course, I would always ask for people to parse that out for me so I could even understand like what that means, right? Because I think a lot of people hear that and they're like, why would I want to have a relationship with Jesus? I've got good I was a very contented atheist. Nothing was broken. Nothing needed to be fixed. Had a great marriage, great career, great kids. Now, so if you ask me, would you like to add this relationship? Why? So in the end, I do understand from the theological perspective, right? That I'm separated from God based on my nature and God's nature, and that Jesus solves this problem. And when I enter into trusting that Jesus solves this problem, things begin to change. The Holy Spirit begins to change things. But I'm always curious about what the word relationship even means in that context. I think a lot of people who are probably listening to us, if they're not part of the church family, if they're not raised in this culture where you hear all the time, it's not about religion, it's about relationship, those to me seem equally confusing as a non-Christian. Like, I don't want religion. I really don't want this relationship either. So tell me why I should be a Christian. That was always my default, right? When I was approached by Christians who would use Christianese language that to me didn't help me to understand what was true about God.
Right. And, I experienced that too in ministry. And I hate to say this, that I've actually experienced more, just backlash, condemnation, everything under the sun in ministry than I have in like some unbelievers. I have some atheists in my life actually who exemplify Christ more than some, Christians. And I think that's the reason why the unbelieving world looks at us and says, why would I want that life? Why didn't I can just sin without all these rules. You guys are living the same life we do, and you're just bound by all of these laws that God has given you. So why should I partake in any of that? I have my liberty. We are not exemplifying. I think the problem is the church today. I mean, we are living in that church age. What do you think?
Well, I think that, so I struggle with this, right? Because if you're going to look at, there's a role that we play as Christians. We ought to be living a transformed life. There's no doubt about that. Right. At the same time, the people who live the most transformed life, it appears to me, are not Christians. They're Mormons. I mean, most of the Mormons you meet you will always hear like the one descriptor used over and over again. Those are the nicest people I've ever met.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe it's true within Mormonism that Mormons might say this about themselves, but certainly from the outside, it does appear that they're doing a better job at modeling Christ for the culture. But of course, you should expect that if your salvation is dependent upon your good behavior, well, then I would expect their behavior to be better than ours, because their salvation it depends on that good behavior.
Right.
Anytime you're in a works-based system like that, you have a tendency to see people who do better. As a matter of fact, when I've been in conversations with Mormons, if anyone gets a little bit feisty, you just say something like, well, I kind of sense a spirit of contentiousness, which under Mormon language basically means you're stepping outside of the behavior that you would say is required for exaltation, this contentious nature. And typically you'll see people align themselves perfectly back now again. I'll snap back into a very Christ-like demeanor. I don't know that as Christians we do that nearly as well. I mean, I think sometimes we're not nearly as well behaved as the people we're trying to reach with the gospel. And I think it's because we realize that how we even think about the idea of grace and how that's offered to us can sometimes give some people liberty to think that they can, they're forgiven for any future behavior also. So therefore, I don't have to watch those future behaviors all that well, right? So I think there is a sense in which Mormons talk about cheap grace when they talk about Christians and when they talk to us as Christians. And I think I can understand why that might happen on occasion.
Yes, and it's interesting because when I have these, like speaking of these people in my family, they are genuine. They say they love the Lord, but there's this just the deception there. And I come from a Catholic, Mormon family, Christian. It's kind of like a cocktail of religion. But the one thing that I see is that the fruits are not exemplifying the things that they say they believe. And one of the main reasons for having, this testimony channel is that I want to show the power of Christ through the true faith of the biblical Christianity. And, evidence is, we have an evidence-based faith. And like I was saying, it's not enough to just say, I believe. My beliefs have no impact on truth. It's the truth that should impact what I believe, but what we all believe,
Right.
And Satan comes as an angel of light. And even as a new believer, I knew the truth. I was saved radically, and Satan knew that he could not throw me off my path with unbelievers. So what he did is he used believers who were not walking in the true light of Christ to try to throw me off my path, to try to deceive me. And so that's what we're finding in all of these false religions. And so can you please maybe speak about the difference between Christianity and all the other religions in like a nutshell?
Well, I mean, think about even when you compare, like to talk about to Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses or anybody else who has taken the core truths of Christianity and taken an extra step, a spin from those core truths, the behaviors that they would say are godly, Christ-like behaviors, those are pretty much the same across the board, right? So how we are to behave, that seems to be very, very similar because they're looking at the sermons of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, teaching of the New Testament, the letters of Paul. So that we share those things in common. And so we kind of end up developing the same core values, pardon me, that we would share. But what separates us from those groups is that we can make a case that this is factually true, that they cannot make. So in other words, we can look at the events of history, the resurrection of Jesus, the events that are described in those 3 years before the resurrection, right, on the New Testament pages. And if you compare those, for example, to the Book of Mormon, you cannot make a case for the 1,000-year history recorded in the Book of Mormon relative to the 3-year history recorded in the New Testament. There's no comparison. There's a reason why we have maps, and because we can actually locate and identify on a map the cities that are described in the New Testament and their relationships to one another. But all the cities that are described in the Book of Mormon, for example, are unlocatable. There are no maps in the Book of Mormon because you cannot locate these things. There's no single archaeological site in which you can find a single name that's even mentioned in the Book of Mormon, be it for a city or for a person or for a people group. You cannot find coins that are described in quite detail in the Book of Mormon. There's an entire monetary system described that was used in the North American continent. There's not a single coin. Now, you don't have a problem finding coins from the 1st century in the area around Jerusalem. So the coins that are described in the New Testament exist. The coins described in the Book of Mormon don't. And that's really the distinctive here, is that we can offer a testimony. I can tell you how I first heard the gospel. And I probably will not share with you how it's changed my life, because I don't think that really matters. I think what matters is, I can tell you how I encountered the truth, and then I can show you the why I believe evidentially it is the truth. And that's what I hope will move you, because I know too many people who have been moved by a really powerful personal narrative and join movements that they shouldn't have joined because there's a charismatic leader who had a very powerful personal narrative. And I think we have to be careful of those kinds of things. We're to test those kinds of things. And so I just think for me, it's a both and. I will tell you how I first opened the New Testament to examine it. But in the end, I want to be able to make the case for why the New Testament is true.
Right. Do you think that's an issue in the church now, the difference between sensationalists and cessationalists, that some people they're going to opposite extremes. I mean, I grew up with a really amazing, Calvary Chapel teaching ministry, but even in good ministries, there's certain things that they don't touch upon, spiritual gifts, and it can lead you in one direction if you don't have that, if you don't come under God's authority and teach the full counsel of God. I mean, I think people are really afraid, even the really profound pastors these days, so I kind of, on my journey, I had to kind of scramble around until I really found that true path of light where God was really leading me in his word.
Well, I think in the end, whatever we do, whatever claims are being made by any teacher, they're going to be measured against the word. So we're going to always have to know, and that's part of the problem, is that most of us don't understand the measuring stick all that well, right? We hear something and it sounds spiritual. It even sounds like it capitalizes on language that comes out of the New Testament, but we don't know the New Testament well enough ourselves to spot the lie when it comes down the trail. And that's part of the problem, right? So we don't have a working knowledge. And that's why I love systematic theology. I love studying these things. And that's where my master's is in theology, because I think it's really important to be able to test concepts by some standard. Now, you might say the standard is just my own personal experience. If I test the concept and it works for me, or it has produces fruit in my life, well, then it's true. By the way, this is how Mormons test their concepts. They would say that how you test the truth, because the truth bears fruit. And if you're not bearing fruit, what you have is not true. We bear fruit over here, they would say. We bear more fruit than any other group. So we don't have any paid leaders, for example. No one in our wards are paid by any. That money doesn't go into leadership. We don't have a paid pastor getting rich. We don't have any of that. Okay, we have better fruit. And that's how you can tell that our system is true. So I think that false systems can also provide fruit. That alone is not going to tell us if a claim is true, because there are a lot of secular false claims that work. They're pragmatic. Have you ever told a successful lie? I have. Whenever I ask my wife if I'm losing my hair, she tells me a successful lie, and it works really great. Does not make it true, even though it works. So I think part of it for us is to be able to say, hey, if it works, that's not necessarily sufficient. We'd have to say that you have to test it in some other way. I do believe that the gifts and the powers of God is God. God was God in the New Testament. God is God today. Whatever power God had in the New Testament, he certainly has today. I don't accept the offices are still in place. So if somebody said that they had, does God have prophetic power in this? Of course. But I don't accept the position of a prophet right now in the 21st century. I think he'd have to be tested, or she'd have to be tested in a way that before I could ever. And of course, the test for a prophet is in Deuteronomy 18, and that means 100% accurate all the time, always has been. That's a hard test to pass, and this is why, for example, I don't follow Joseph Smith, because as a prophet, he wasn't 100% accurate.
Right. And people tend to forget that even in the body of Christ, that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so, I think of Joel 2:28, Acts 2:17, where I will pour out my Holy Spirit in these last days. And, people abuse that power, and people also completely neglect that power. And so I'm glad that we have, this testimony channel where we can have, people, God bring truth in with these powerful testimonies. But I just had one question. I know you're not really sharing your testimony, but what was the pivotal moment in your career where you actually, your eyes were just enlightened? Because I had a completely radical experience, but it took me about a year to come down from that high to understand what it really meant to be a disciple of Christ. People are like, she's sign searching, colors, all that stuff. So
I think everyone's different, right? And so how God reaches different people is based on the wiring of each person. And so that's why you see such a variety. Probably as you collect testimonies on this channel, you're going to see a wide variety of people who have different claims or make different claims or have different experiences. And I think that's probably true for me. I was the kind of person who would never trust a personal experience to the point that I would give it any. So if I had an experience, I would never have trusted it, because I work with people all the time who tell me they've had experiences and often are lying to me. This is the nature of police work. This is the nature of detective work. 60% of the claims you're going to encounter are false claims. So I just, unless it can be tested, I wouldn't have trusted even my own personal experience. I mean, I just wouldn't have. So that presents a barrier for a lot of people. And I'm not a guy who had a moment. That's not the way that cumulative cases work. So I've never There are times when you're working a suspect where you're starting to assemble this case and you're thinking, oh, boy, this looks pretty good. And the more you assemble it, it looks better. And then I get to a threshold point where I say, okay, that straw there, I think is enough. Now we have a fileable case. We can win in front of a jury. I think I've at some point along the way, I've decided that the best inference is that he's my guy. He's the suspect. And then at some point along the way, we reach another threshold where I'm like, okay, now I can actually make this case in front of a jury. And it's cumulative, right? So it's a large body of things that come together. And so it's really about, that's what I did with the Gospels. I was working through those. You'll see in my book, Cold Case Christianity, I talk about the 4 areas that we test eyewitness testimony. We test it in terms of, were they really there to see what they said they saw? Because they're lying about that. Can they be corroborated in some way? Have they been honest and accurate over time without changing their story? And finally, they possess a bias that would cause them to lie to us. So for me, as I assembled that case, it was, dozens of pieces of evidence in each of those 4 categories until I finally got to the weight of it and said, okay, as much as I really reject supernatural explanations, so I was so very committed philosophical naturalist. I would not have ever believed that a miracle is an accurate report in any body of history. I would have said that's a different genre of literature. That's mythology. That you don't include supernatural explanations in history any more than you would look for a supernatural explanation at a crime scene. So I was, willing to say that some of this is true, but it can't all be true because this includes miracles. And then I had to kind of work through something I talk about in God's Crime Scene, another book I wrote, really to ask the question, did I have good reason to reject supernatural explanations in the first place? And so I had to do both of those things. And that's why I know the date at which I was baptized, because I've got a certificate, okay, from the church where I was baptized. But if you asked me, like, how long before that, it's probably somewhere between 6 to 8 months, maybe not quite a year probably, but it's probably about that long for me to wheedle through all this. And during that time, I would return to church, not every weekend, but on occasion I would return to church with my wife and I would hear a little more, but really I felt like I needed to shoulder the entire investigation. So it was not going to be something that he was going to say from the pulpit that was going to convince me so much as it was going to be something I discovered from history as I was testing these claims made in the New Testament.
Yeah. Your testimony is so unique. I think yours is, I don't know any other detectives like you. Do you see any hope in your line of work? How is it transitioning, from, homicide to cold case Christianity? Do you have people in your line of work who have been interested in what you're doing? I mean, you have all these presupposition lists, and I've experienced presupposition more in the body of Christ actually than some like atheists I know. People are very fearful. And so what's your experience with that in your line of work?
Well, I think, my dad was in this line of work before me. I was born in his police academy. And my
about 60 years, right?
Yeah. And my son was born in my police academy. So, we've been in the job now for almost 60 years. And so I still, I talk to my son about how things are today compared to how they were in my generation, compared to how they were in his grandfather's generation. And I think that I was a cop for a long time before I became a Christian. So a lot of the habits that you develop, and they're hard to get rid of. Right. So I still am not at a halfway point. It'll be another 12 years before I'm at a point where I'm at the halfway mark. And I can say I've been a Christian half my life. So for the most part, most of my life, I have been thinking and behaving and acting like somebody who rejected there's anything other than us on planet Earth, anything other than natural causes for any phenomena. And so that's hard I think it's hard to transition from that, right? To thinking about God as an even an involved party. Okay. And so I think what happens is that you have to constantly fight with your old nature. The same as Paul talked about in Romans 7, right?
Yes.
Stuff I want to do, I don't do. I know I should do, and I don't do. And there's stuff I don't do that I know I ought to do. And that's a very struggle. Yeah. That's a struggle for me too. I mean, it's a struggle for all of us. But a lot of it's getting rid of your bad habits. Right. So I would say that my life after becoming a Christian was definitely different because you start to care about, you start to open up a little bit and care more about people, and you start to see yourself as really not all that different than any bad guy you've ever worked. So, a lot of my friends who aren't Christians, they see this gap between good guys and bad guys. And then as you become a Christian, you realize there's no good guys. There's just gradations of what you might call bad guys. But to be honest,
different levels of God.
Yeah. And in God's eyes, there's not even any gradations in terms of what would qualify us to be in his presence, at least. So I think a lot of this was what changed the most was that I began to see people and see myself in those people and see them in me, and see the similarities. And then when you realize how much you've been forgiven for, it is easier to forgive others. So I think that's probably the biggest change.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that. It's one of the things that I share in my testimony is when, I had a radical experience, and, God broke into my realm, and he said, "Wake up, Vanessa, the king is coming soon." But the most profound moments when I walked out onto the streets and everything looked different. And not only did I see, people, I saw souls with a purpose, and I knew that they were somebody that Christ died for. And it's that love that transcended from the Father,
Sure.
And it's one of the reasons why I'm doing this testimony channel is because I want people to see the evidence, and evidence is the key word. We don't want blindly. We have an evidence-based faith, and that's why I'm so happy you're here to give us that.
Think about this, for example, and this is something that I think we have to kind of guard ourselves against a little bit, right? Even as Christians. If we said, okay, I want to share with you the experience that I had that led me to become a Christian, then the first thing I think we're talking to people who are going to say, okay, so do I need to have that experience to be a Christian?
Right.
And for example, we've seen charismatic movements that would say, yeah, you do have to have that experience if you want to call yourself a Christian. So now we find ourselves in a position where, what if I don't have that experience? What if I don't have any of that? What if I don't have the kind of what if I walk out after deciding this is true and I don't see things differently on the street? What if I don't? None of that stuff happens. Am I less or more or what? Now, what's interesting about taking an evidential approach is that is repeatable for all of us. So in other words, it's not based on an experience. It's based on these set of things that are outside my experience that are just true about history and true about Jesus. And that's accessible in a way that my personal experiences are not, right? I cannot reproduce my experience for somebody to assure them that they're now in, but I can reconstruct the case. And this is, by the way, exactly, can you imagine if John the Baptist, when he was having doubts and sent disciples to Jesus,
right?
He's not in custody and he wants to know, are you the one? Well, if Jesus had said to them, well, doesn't he remember the experience he had? That's not what he does. He could have said that. He very easily could have said, look, guys, this is based on your experiences, and therefore you need to return to your experiences. Instead, he works 3 miracles in front of John's disciples and says, go back and tell John what you just saw. So
you're saying that he heals before he gives the message.
Yes, he provides evidence. It's not always a healing. It could be something else. But once he does something that demonstrates the power of God, he'll say in John, for example, if you don't believe me, at least believe on the miracles I worked in front of you. Right. Very much an evidentialist who's returning to the evidence.
Wow, that's amazing. And do you, I would like to talk a little bit about the evidence for the resurrection. Would you mind giving our audience just, you just told us about how you came to the faith, but just specifically regarding the resurrection, about eyewitness accounts and how you kind of came to that with your experience and your background.
Well, I'll just tell you that without focusing on just the claims of the New Testament seem ludicrous in so many ways. They involve so many supernatural events, including the resurrection, but also walking on water and raising people from the dead, all these kinds of things that just to me would have said there was out of bounds. But when you test eyewitness accounts, you test them in a number of ways. And one of the things you test is, was this guy who says he saw the murder, was he really there? Or is he some friend of the murderer who just wants me to believe he's there because he wants to help out his buddy? This does happen. So it's really about us saying, okay, well, how do we test these claims? I'll tell you that one of the things that was most persuasive for me was the early dating, because that's the first question. Were they really there? Look, if you want to lie about Jesus and say he rose from the dead when really he didn't, just do it 100 years later when no one's around to know the truth. Wait till everyone's dead, then you can say whatever you want about Jesus. So the first question for me is this written early enough in history so that, number one, it could be written by people who actually saw it. Because that's the claim, right? Peter in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, he talks about how we saw this with our own eyes. John talks about in one of his letters. He says, hey, we actually are eyewitnesses. So the question becomes, were they really eyewitnesses? Were the authors really there, these New Testament authors? Or did they write this early enough that there could be people who were there who could call them out if they're lying? Because at least you can fact check a faulty statement. If you write it early enough where the people who would have known the truth about Jesus could say that's not true and write their own version maybe. So I think part of it is, for me, was how early was it dated? And I think there's good reason to believe it's dated much earlier than either German scholarship 200 years ago or skeptical scholarship in the years since would claim. The earliest scholarship on this, by the way, always claimed it was written early by the eyewitnesses. But of course, as we get into the 19th century and 20th century, we see kind of a manuscript skepticism rise. And then suddenly people are saying, well, it's not that early, because they don't want to believe it's true anyway. But my point is, for me, there's good evidence in the text itself, because there are missing elements from the New Testament that should be there, because the people who were writing the text should have included these details, given their predisposition toward being very accurate about other details. So, for example, Luke in the book of Acts never describes the destruction of the temple, even though he says that Jesus predicted it in the Gospels. So Jesus allegedly predicted the destruction of the temple. Why not include the destruction of the temple so you can show the reader, Theophilus, the first reader of Acts? Allegedly, he wrote this for Theophilus. Okay, well, at least I can show Theophilus that Jesus was an accurate predictor, right? Because it turns out he allegedly predicted the temple was destroyed, and then it did happen. Well, look, he doesn't mention it anywhere. He doesn't mention the siege of Jerusalem. He doesn't mention the death of Peter. Peter's a big deal in the book of Acts. Doesn't mention the death of Paul, another big deal in the book of Acts. Doesn't mention the death of James, the brother of Jesus, another big. Doesn't mention the death of Barnabas. All of these people died before 61, right around 61 to 63, 64 AD. They died in the 60s. And by the way, Luke mentions the death of James, the brother of John, who is not nearly as significant as James, the brother of Jesus. He died in 44, James, the brother of John. So why do we have all these missing events, missing deaths that are the key players in the book of Acts? The three most important people are James, Peter, Paul. We know when they died, but Luke never mentions it. Well, if it hasn't happened yet, Luke can't mention it. And that's why I place the dating of the book of Acts before the first missing event, which would be probably around 60 before the missing event of James, the brother of Jesus, dying in Jerusalem. Okay, so now you can test this to see if this is true. You'll see that Paul quotes Luke in his letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy. And then he quotes Luke in the letter to the Corinthians when he's describing the Lord's Supper. He quotes the Gospel of Luke there as well.
Right.
And that means he's got to have the Gospel of Luke. And most, even skeptics, will place the writing of 1 Corinthians in the 50s. And then he's going to quote more than any other source in his book. Luke quotes Mark. That means that Mark's gospel's got to be earlier. Look, you're within now 20 years of the events. And although I know people will say, well, nobody can remember anything for 20 years and be accurate. Well, actually, I do cold cases where I'll find a witness from 30 years ago. And the issue becomes, is the thing that person remembers unique enough to stick out in their memory? And most homicides, if you've never seen one, if you see one, it'll probably stick in your memory. And also remember, when I'm talking to my witness from 30 years ago in a cold case, it may be that she's never really talked about it that much until I ask her to talk about it 30 years later. But this was not the case for the disciples, who waited a long time before they wrote these gospels, I think because they thought that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. And they repeated what they had seen as eyewitnesses over and over and over again in every contact. Remember, testimony was not, let me tell you how Jesus changed my life, or let me tell you what happened on the day I came to Jesus. No, testimony was, let me show you and talk to you about what we saw with our own eyes. Because as Peter says in Acts, in Pentecost, he says, Jesus was attested to you with miracles that he performed. And these disciples consistently testified to the entire ministry of Jesus until they finally wrote it down. And when you do that over in an oral culture where you're doing that over and over and over again, there's a good chance you're going to capture something true in your event, in your account. And that's one of the things I had to look at. But I think that early dating is demonstrably early in my view. And I think you can look both internally and externally to see why that's the case. And I think that in the end, that solves a lot more problems than you might think, because if you're saying, well, hey, was it distorted over time? Well, if it's written early and you can start early, that helps you to determine if that's true. Is it a lie? Well, it's harder to lie if you write it early around people who would know better. So the early dating actually does affect a lot of other areas of skepticism.
Right. And I think of the Quran, Lee Strobel, I would love to have him on our show. And he's talking about the early datings of Christianity compared to the Quran. Was it like 600 years past, Right. And he goes, I prefer my datings to be earlier to the time of the event. And how do you, what are the questions that pop up mostly when you're speaking at these events, you're going to lectures? I'm sure that you were speaking in front of a lot of atheists, as Frank Turek is as well, and some of your people in that realm of your circle there.
Well, you hear all kinds of, there's always, every case has weaknesses, including the case for the truth. So even when I've investigated claims that I know I've got the true case, I've got the evidence to demonstrate that this is our suspect, I know that case also has weaknesses, though. That's the nature of every case. Every case has strengths and weaknesses. So what people will do is they'll look for the weaknesses in a case, right? And say, well, look, you don't have this or you don't have that. And that doesn't mean that the case is not true. It just means that there are going to be limitations. So, for example, corroborating the New Testament is something people always ask for. What evidence do we have outside of the New Testament that corroborates the New Testament? And part of the problem you're going to have with that is that they don't really understand the nature of corroborative evidence that we use in trial, for example. So if I have a robber who jumped over a counter and that's the claim of the witness, well, I might be able to find a palm print on the counter that demonstrates, in fact, he did put his palm there, probably when he was jumping over. But this does not act as a video of the event. This doesn't even tell me what he's wearing or what leg went over the counter first. You can't get a lot from a palm print. But the palm print is considered corroborative of the claim, even though it only gives you a small fraction of the claim. So that's just the realistic nature of corroborative evidence. And when you look at the corroborative evidence we have for the New Testament, even though you might say, well, you cannot confirm every event archaeologically that is claimed in the New Testament. Of course you can't. It's touch point corroborative evidence. You're going to get some small percentage. And so what you're looking for is that small percentage. If you said, well, look, I don't have anyone who wrote an account of Jesus as a non-believer at the time he was alive. I hear this all the time. Well, here's the problem with that. The problem with that, of course, is that if you're looking for somebody who was skeptical or somebody who was not a believer, somebody who was not even looking for the Messiah, somebody who was outside the group, right? Because they had a big group that was being, that John the Baptist had kind of mentored, to the point where when John saw Jesus, he told his disciples, there goes the Lamb of God. And they all then left him, or some did, not all, but most, and they joined Jesus. Well, so I can't trust any of those people. They're all people who were anticipating. They were following the cousin of Jesus, for crying out loud. People can't be trusted. Well, there's a writer out there who wrote an account of Jesus at the very same time that the others were written, in the same range of dates. And he was not part of that group. As a matter of fact, he was despised. Nobody wanted him to be part of the group. His name was Levi. Now, after 3 years of watching that stuff, he was in. That's the problem, is that, look, if you think there's going to be an atheist who's going to be sitting next to Jesus, writing this thing from an atheist, at some point he's going to see that stuff and become part of the team. He's going to be convinced by the observations, this is Levi. So now he's in. You cannot fault him because he happens to be in at the end of it after seeing all of that. You cannot fault him. If you're looking at somebody, though, who was not part of the group, who is not part of the discipleship, didn't know John the Baptist, didn't know those folks, they didn't want him in the group, that guy's name is Levi, and his name is also Matthew, and he writes one of the Gospels. So I don't think you can discredit. When I hear someone say, I would need to have a robust gospel from an atheist or non-Christian in the first century, that really what tells me is that you don't trust. Let's put it this way. If we removed all of the miracle accounts from the Gospels, just took them out, so there's no virgin birth, there's no walking on water, there's no feeding 5,000, there's no healings, there's no resurrection for sure, no ascension. Jesus is just a moral teacher who preaches sermons and then eventually dies in the first century. If all we had were the four Gospels describing that, nobody for a second would deny the existence of Jesus or would really doubt the veracity of the claims of the New Testament.
Mm.
Where skepticism comes is because there are miracles in those New Testaments. That is the chief source of skepticism. He would just be another ancient sage that nobody doubted existed. He'd be like Baha'u'llah, whose writings, how do you know the Baha'u'llah's writings, but the Baha'i faith? They're just wisdom statements. No one doubts the existence of Baha'u'llah or the veracity of those wisdom statements, because none of the story includes anything miraculous. They're just the wise statements of an ancient sage. If that's all Jesus was, there'd be no doubters. But the problem is that there are miracles in those accounts. And that exposes to me what the source of doubt really is. It's not about the text and the manuscript evidence and all other things. No, it's about the existence of, you have a bias toward the natural. You have a presuppositional bias against anything supernatural. I get it. I had that also. But for me, at some point, I realized that as somebody who believed in Big Bang cosmology, that everything in the universe, all space, time, and matter came into existence from nothing, I already accepted one extra natural cause. The cause of the universe was outside of space, time, and matter. And I already accepted that as an atheist. So the question then becomes, okay, if that extra natural cause that's non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material also happens to be a personal being, then that would be the most significant miracle of all, everything in the universe from nothing. And stuff like walking on water would be small potatoes. So I at least opened the door to kind of surrender my presuppositional bias against anything extranatural until I had actually examined the evidence in the New Testament.
All right. Well, that's going to be my next question too. And for the audience, when you are coming up against, say your Mormon family, like mine, this hits home. It really does. What are the main arguments, or what are the things that you bring up in terms of, because Mormons, they believe that these extra biblical sources came from, a Holy Spirit experience where they, and we have those experiences too as Christians. And how do we minister to that group where we say, yeah, we both have had experience, but which one is true?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways you can approach this. I mean, I don't want to get into a battle of experience, which is why I don't typically talk about my testimony. Right. I don't typically share my experiences, because then we're back down to a battle of experiences. And there's always going to be somebody who's had a more dramatic, more beautifully, emotional experience than you have,
right.
or a grander experience. For example, you even said that your testimony, you had a radical. Well, why are you using the word radical? Because you want to differentiate it from other types of religious experiences, that this is somehow different. And we can get caught up in that, right? Where we're saying, hey, well, you might have had an experience, but I had a radical experience. And so I typically will stop and say, well, why do you believe this is true? On the basis of what do you believe this is true? And I just ask good questions, right? Like, how do you decide if something is true? And I also can share with Mormons, at least, that I wanted Mormonism to be true. When I first became interested in the manuscript evidence for Christianity, my Mormon family presented me with the Book of Mormon. Well, I didn't stop there. I've got it on my shelf back here. I bought a quad, right? That's the Old and New Testament, Book of Mormon, Pearly Great Price, and Doctrines and Covenants first, then Pearly Great Price. So you have these four scriptures. They call it the quad, and it's in all the Mormon missionaries will carry that thing with them. So I bought a quad and I started going through it, because I thought, look, I'm not sure what's true, or if any of this is true, or if all of it's false, or what. I knew it all couldn't be true, though, because they're making very different claims. So I knew that the claims were opposing. So they couldn't all be true. They could all be false, or one could be true. But because they make contradictory claims, they can't all be true. So I knew that was our situation. And I had family, my half brothers and sisters. My dad's a committed atheist. Nobody else in the family is a believer. But I did have the 6 siblings who would, at least at that time, have claimed they were Mormons. So it would have been great to join them if Mormonism was true. But as I examined the Book of Mormon, I saw that 4-part test that I applied to the Gospels, it doesn't help the Book of Mormon. It actually falsifies the Book of Mormon pretty quickly. And so that's where I got to a point where I said, okay, I know that I'm not sure if Christianity is true, but sadly, I do know that Mormonism is false. So I needed to keep on in a different direction. But I would have loved, and I always tell people, Mormons at least, that I was, interested in, and the Mormons said to me, they came to my door because my family set me up. And the Mormon missionaries came and they said, you just need to read the Book of Mormon and pray about it. Well, I actually was one of those guys who read the Book of Mormon and prayed about it. And of course, I don't trust any experiences. So I wasn't like, no, but I'll tell you what I did do. I kept on reading. So I read through all Doctrines and Covenants. Every Mormon should read Doctrines and Covenants, especially the commands of God toward Emma, Joseph's wife, when it comes to polygamy. Read through the entire Doctrines and Covenants. Then I kept on reading. And I read through the Pearl of Great Price, including the Book of Abraham. And when I got to the Book of Abraham, now I had demonstrative proof that Mormonism was false. Because he translated the Book of Mormon from golden plates, but he translated the Book of Mormon from a papyrus that he bought from a museum curator salesman who approached him with some other artifacts from Egyptian tombs and wanted to sell the entire thing to him. And he bought that manuscript because he said it included the words of Abraham when he was in Egypt. And so he calls it the Book of Abraham. And he translated the papyrus. He translated it. The papyrus was lost for years, but discovered in the 1960s. And we now have the papyrus from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham. And it does not say anything. That there's not even the word Abraham anywhere on that papyrus. It's a book of breathings, a very common Egyptian papyrus. And it has nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. And now we have demonstrative proof that we don't have the words of God anyway, that at least the Book of Abraham was falsely translated. And that was enough for me to say, wow. And so I sometimes will just say, I hear you. I want, like you, I want to know if God exists, and I want to know if he's spoken to us through Scripture. Have you investigated the Book of Abraham? Because I've looked at the Book of Abraham, and I've looked at every skeptical view and every Mormon view, because Mormons have written about the Book of Abraham and have tried to defend it. And they try to defend it a number of different ways. And I would love for you just to investigate that for yourself. Now, here's the biggest problem that you have with Mormons, in my view, is that once you've been lied to once about Jesus, you're not likely to be lied to again. And so Mormons don't typically leave Mormonism to become Christians. They typically leave Mormonism to become atheists. Only once, right? So that's part of the problem. And so I always want to be very... where in the beginning, when I first discovered this, I felt like I needed to climb a mountain and tell every Mormon I knew this is not true. My view now is that I want to be much kinder and less dogmatic about it, because in the end, it's pretty sad. And when you discover something that is really valuable, incredibly valuable to your family, to the way you were raised, to your own culture, and you discover that's not true, it's going to be devastating. So I want us to be prepared for that and be the kind of people who love Mormons enough to want to share the truth. They've got some things, they already are familiar with the Gospels. They already are familiar with the New Testament. I want to make sure we just kind of weed out what's not true, but don't lose what is true. Right.
And that's how Satan works, right? He's very subtle. And, speaking with my family the last couple of weeks, I find what's very dangerous is that, like I mentioned earlier, that God says, I want you either hot or cold, or I will spit you out of my mouth if you are lukewarm. And I find that most people are very apathetic towards faith today. And people have asked me questions, and I kind of want to pose one of the questions that people ask frequently. And one of those is, I'll just get right into it. My aunt asked me about, there's so many wonderful stories in the Bible, and some of them are really true, but things like the pillar of salt, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt. I mean, those are just grandiose. So what do you do when people pose these things where they can believe certain miracles, but not others? I mean, I look at people in the New Age, they can believe these grandiose things about aliens, about all these other things, but when it comes to Christ, let's not look at him. Let's not look at Christ over there.
Well, let's ask this question: like, what is it about? What is it about the claim that you see on pages of the Old Testament? What makes it so unbelievable? What makes it so out of the box? And because again, it's going to come down to many of us hold a bias against anything supernatural, but there are really that bias also means we hold a bias against anything that's not material, right? So, for example, I can be sure that these glasses exist, but I can't be sure about things like God or angels or things that are immaterial because I don't see them. I can't touch them. I can't measure them. I can't test them in some way. I get it. But there's lots of things about the universe that you cannot measure and test. And so you already believe in something that's outside of space, time, and matter, more than likely. And the science demonstrates that there's something outside of space, time, and matter if Big Bang cosmology, which is still called the standard cosmological model, because it is the standard cosmological model today, that demonstrates that we are in a universe that came into existence from nothing. All space, time, and matter did not exist before the universe existed. So there wasn't a spatial void and then the universe. No. There's no space before space. So we're looking for a cause that starts the universe, and we know it had a beginning from the science. We're looking for a cause that's outside of space, time, or matter. Now, look, for me, I'm stuck with extra natural causes. So why would I be surprised that if there is a being out there and he's acting at points in history, he would act in ways that would have to be described as supernatural? I mean, I'm not going to discard those possibilities yet. I'm not going to run to every supernatural claim, though, either. I'm going to take my time and test the claims as best I can. And so at the end, I think that's part of it, is that really what holds people out is a bias they have against such things rather than how good or how weak the evidence is for such things.
Right. I'm so glad you used the word science. And I have to quote Ken Ham on this, is that the atheists have hijacked the term science. And so do you speak about these things in any of your lectures about how people have just completely, what Ken Ham says, just hijacked it for themselves? It's an anti-God religion, really.
Well, right. I think what we want to do is we want to be able to, I'm always careful, right? I mean, I want to be careful about how I say it in such a way that is not so pejorative that then the side I'm trying to actually reach is already not listening. So if I say, for example, that atheists have hijacked science, I suspect probably most people I'm trying to reach are not listening anymore. What I think happens, though, is that it's fair that there's a difference between facts and inferences, including scientific facts and scientific inferences. So what I would say is that, yeah, there's evidence out there. I love science. We use the science all the time. We use forensic science all the time. Christians have historically led in the sciences. I'm writing a new book, and I've just done an examination of the history of science. It is dominated and oversized proportion by Christians. Even the scientific recipients of the Nobel laureate are largely Christians. That's the largest group. So in the end, we don't have to be alienated from the science, but the question becomes, if the facts that we gather doing science, at some point we have to make an inference from those facts. And the inference varies. Unfortunately, it's not just the facts that draw inferences. We know this from selecting juries. A lot of times it's your biases, what you like, what you don't like, your personal history. Have you ever dealt with someone like that? What you hope for the future? It's all these very personal, subjective things that go into the inference process. So you have these objective facts, then you have this very subjective experience that goes into the inference from facts. And so what happens here is that you end up with two jurors that can look at the exact same evidences for 5 weeks, yet render two different verdicts. Well, why? Because it's not just the facts. It's making that inference from facts. When I make a case for God's existence, I am looking at all and using all the same evidence that the Darwinist is going to use to make an inference for evolution. The facts are the same. I'm looking at the exact same set of facts that he's looking at. And the scientists got us those facts. But once they do, a scientist makes an inference. And if he possesses a worldview that is biased against anything supernatural, he will come to one kind of conclusion. If he holds a worldview that says, look, I'm not going to be biased against it, but I'm not going to lean toward it either, I'm just going to be open to the possibility of it, he may come to a different kind of an inference. And that's why it's so important to be able to distinguish those two. So what I try to do is say, hey, I get it. You want to use the science. I want to use the science. I don't want to co-opt it for my use. I don't want you to co-opt it either. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, how did we get that inference from those facts? Because in the end, all the people who are arguing for intelligent design, especially at the biological level, the molecular biological level, like a Michael Behe, for example, they are using the same scientific facts that those who would argue for Darwinism are using. They just come to different kinds of inferences, and they can make a case from the science for their inference as well.
Is that similar to circumstantial evidence? I know that you were talking about in some of these crime scenes. You were saying that the evidence is not exactly what gives you your leads, your suspects. You know, there are so many people that that I speak to about this, and they call themselves scientists. I care only about evidence. Yet when the evidence is presented to them, they could care less. Like, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, we always talk about this, and I think Frank probably might have mentioned this too. I don't know the difference between science and scientism. Science is simply a process by which we determine certain facts that we discover using scientific processes. But scientism is the idea that the only way you can know truth at all is through the sciences. And I think we would say, no, we are in favor. Christians are in favor of the sciences, but we're not holding to scientism. We believe there are many ways to determine certain truths. For example, science can tell you nothing about math facts. You have to have those math facts in place before you can do science. So science doesn't tell you about math. Math is used to do science. Science also can't tell you about the laws of logic. Those have to be in place first so I can reason well about the evidence. There are lots of things that you cannot learn from science. So science cannot be the source of all truth, but it can be a source of some truth. And so that's why we would say, hey, we're open to using the sciences. And this is why you'll see so many Christians like a Kepler and who believed that what they were doing, where they were simply thinking the thoughts of God after him, that they were writing the book of nature, which is the two books they saw, the book of scripture, the book of nature, special revelation, natural revelation, and that their job as scientists was to fill in the truth of natural revelation. Both of these books, they would have argued, point to God. So you can do this work and point to God by doing it. And that was their view. And this is why so many Christians, even today, what I'm trying to do is make a list, comprehensive list of the notable Christians who have been fathers of scientific disciplines. You have no idea how large that list is.
Wow. Praise the Lord on that. And I am so sorry, we only have about 5 minutes left. Is there anything that I can hand to you that you would like to share with our audience? Something that you're working on now? What's your next move? What are you working on in ministry?
I'm writing another book, but I would just encourage the audience that your audience, especially all of us who are just trying to reach people who are maybe not necessarily apologetics geeks, right? I mean, there's a lot of us are. You know, if I'm going to go buy a book, I'm probably going to buy a book that's in the field that I am already geeked out about, right? And so I think in the church in general, though, that is the pursuit of why this is true is not nearly as popular as the pursuit of how can this make me feel better? How can this improve my life? How can this change the way I think about things? And I think that it turns out that one actually is connected to the other, and people don't always see the connection. So I always put it this way. If you know that something is evidentially true, then even when you have a season of doubt or a season of running off and doing what you want to do because you don't want to obey God, in the end, you're far more likely to return to what you know is true. I've just been denying it because I want to do my thing right now.
That's right.
But the question is, do you know it's evidentially true? And so I think in the end, that's something that is, I want to help people see that that there will be times when this may not feel like it's your best life now. This may not feel like it's the life you even have imagined for yourself. But if the promises of Scripture that your life is beyond the grave, that you will live eternally, and that your life is not limited to 90 years, but will be infinitely long. Well, that's the promise, and you believe that promise, well, then it's a little bit easier to see how experiences or even your view of God really shouldn't be determined by what happens in this life.
Right.
Because we've got good reason to believe that our lives are well beyond the grave. We have to measure what we think and expect, how we even behave in this life based on the promise of forever. And that does change, I think. And I think if we can help people to see that there's good evidence to believe that view of life is true, it's not just wishful thinking, then they're far more likely to live like eternal beings in this life.
Amen. So, my brother, I'm so happy that you came on. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Vanessa.
Totally blesses you for this time, and I hope to have you on sometime in the future. Take care of yourself, and we will hopefully see you soon.
You too. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Faith family, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us, and I pray that you will come back with us as we have our next guest, Patty Height of Out of Egypt Ministries, as she shares her testimony of coming out of the life of homosexuality. You will not want to miss this, so please stay tuned, and I look forward to seeing you next time. God bless and shalom. May God's peace be over you. Take care.